there's like 5 key dynamics when it comes to disinformation within Latinx communities, but also other communities of color. And one is that there are diverse cultural nuances and demographics within the Latino community and other communities of color, especially geographic and generational, which creates opportunities for false information. And then number two, which is why you all are also extremely important, is that there are data and robust information voids in Latinx news, especially Spanish language, that are exploited and easily filled by false or deceptive narratives from bad actors. And we often see that Spanish language voters tend to follow political news less closely, so they're more susceptible to these kind of tactics. And then three, there are also false narratives that are co-opted and rapidly amplified in Spanish, which often goes largely unchecked on social media. There's also external foreign interference, like Russia, that has exploited hot button issues such as immigration, but there's also a lot of domestic actors pushing out disinformation and misinformation. And finally, messaging platforms such as WhatsApp, we know is very popular among the Latino community and also other communities of color. It's central to the spread of information and disinformation, which is an issue because these closed platforms are much harder to know what's going on. So those are just some kind of key dynamics that I think are important to understand how this all works. But I'll just move on to some of the narratives we're seeing. I think the main top line here that I really want to get out there is that bad actors are using social media for the offline goal of suppressing the vote and depressing enthusiasm among key progressive constituencies, including the Latino community. And we often see bad actors trying to inflame pre-existing tensions within and between communities. For example, Jacqueline mentioned Black Lives Matter. We saw a lot of bad actors looking for opportunities to create divisions among communities of color. So we especially saw this from far-right actors, including far-right Latinx actors who, try to attempt to position the Latino and Black communities against each other. But we also see them, trying to divide within the Latino community. So I'm going to talk about some of the key narratives that are prevalent in Latinx spaces, such as protest violence and racial tension, this idea of this perceived threat of socialism, and vote by mail attacks. But really quickly, before I go into the narratives, I do want to mention that we're seeing some far-right Latinx accounts coordinating their efforts, which is a common tactic by bad actors, where they often share the same story or meme with the same post at the same time across their Facebook pages, which allows them to reach more feeds and people. And these posts here are promoting stories of alleged voter fraud and trying to discredit vote by mail efforts, which I'll discuss later. But this coordinated messaging around mail-in voting fraud is already being directed to the Hispanic community. And while there's legitimate confusion, there's a clear intention to create distrust of both political parties and of the system in general in order to depress voter turnout. And then I want to go a little bit more into detail about the narratives around violence and crime. So we're seeing bad actors trying to create racial tension and division among these communities of color, and we continue to see this narrative being pushed in Latinx spaces around the protest violence. So we not only see bad actors attack Black Lives Matter more broadly, but we often see them, tap into racist tropes or white supremacist narratives. So you see from these screenshots here, many, these are all Latinx accounts, some of them Spanish accounts, where they, activated around the murder of a young white kid and specifically promote, race blindness by pointing out that a Black man was a suspect, as you can see from the second and third post. But they use this story to, criticize Black Lives Matter in the media for essentially not protesting the death of the child and for staying silent, which is something that we've seen throughout this year, especially in Latinx spaces. We saw it around the death of Vanessa Guillen, where users were criticizing Black Lives Matter for staying silent and would claim that they didn't care about Latinos or they don't care about anybody outside of the Black community. And this is just another example, the post on the right, it's a narrative that Black Lives Matter is silent on Black crime. And then they use that to claim that the real issue is Black on Black crime over police brutality and systemic racism. That we continue to see far-right and pro-Trump actors amplifying this threat of socialism and this idea that socialism is coming to America. And we see this same message being amplified in Latinx spaces, and they often tailor it to their audiences by attacking, socialist Latin American countries such as Cuba and Venezuela. So we saw a lot of people amplifying, certain speeches during the RNC convention of Latinx speakers, and then, far-right Latinx accounts following them and publishing narratives about this perceived threat of socialism. And then within this narrative, we continue to see a lot of pro-Trump Latinx influencers continue to claim that the left is supportive of these socialist policies and are looking to spread in the United States. As you can see here, the first post connects Biden specifically to socialism, and then the second post also claims that his supporters are like harassing the right, and that these actions are similar to Castro's Cuba, which is a narrative we've seen where they compare, these type of confrontations or the BLM protests to actions in Latin American socialist countries, and then claim that the left is responsible for this, and then use that to promote the narrative that they want socialism. But as you can see, they're also promoting the narrative of Biden, being, quote, the Trojan horse of socialism. And then the post on the right was from another Spanish language account with a big following in Florida, essentially saying that you have to vote for Trump to save the US from socialism. I think overall, the socialism narrative and painting the left as, radical and extreme is a narrative that we'll continue to see in far right Latinx spaces online up to the election and after. But I think it's just another example of bad actors trying to feed into real fears and suspicions that they think Latino voters, including Spanish language voters and recent immigrants, might have.